Let's talk about the middle meningeal artery. Middle meningeal artery, that is the artery to supply the meninges. Okay, so there is a spine here at the base of the skull, and that's why we call it foramen spinosum. After this spine, we have a styloid process here. This one, styloid, oid, style. Yeah, resemble to the needle. بشبه الإبرة, شبيه الإبرة, styloid. I'm not talking about this process. I'm talking about another one here. This process. Okay, this one here. Now, if you put the wire near to it, it should pass through foramen spinosum. So, this is foramen spinosum. If you coming to this foramen from the base of the skull, then guide yourself by this spine. It's right just anteromedial to it. Or much easier, of course, if you follow any sulcus or groove on the lateral side of the skull. It would lead you simply to the foramen spinosum. Okay? Whether we are talking about this, look, put the wire in any groove, it would lead you to the foramen spinosum. Why? Simply, as you know, arteries, they leave their impression on the skull. Okay? Have a look at these impressions. A very important clinical application, that is, if you have an injury to the skull, to the lateral side, overlying this, the pterion, H-shaped pterion, this area, it overlies the branches of the anterior or frontal branch of the middle meningeal artery. Okay, yeah. The blood, the hematoma, we call it extradural hematoma. And the most important thing about it, lucid interval. That is asymptomatic interval. Patients, thank you. هذا رشوة على الكاميرا. Thank you. هو against the regulation ندخل نشرب في المشرحة. Thank you. Okay. الآن so that was clinical note about the middle meningeal artery. Let's not go there. Let's carry on talking about the skull. So how many foramina we have in the middle cranial fossa? Okay? Don't want you to memorize them. The easiest thing, in fact, to memorize them: superior orbital fissure, rotundum, oval, spinosum, lacerum, carotid. I don't want you to memorize them. This is not the idea. The idea to understand how we transmit structures from the middle cranial fossa to either the orbit, through superior orbital fissure, pterygopalatine fossa, okay, or the infratemporal fossa, okay. Before I proceed, let me just demonstrate the pathway of the maxillary nerve. This is very complicated. So we have agreed that the maxillary nerve leaves the skull from foramen rotundum. Now, this is foramen rotundum. Now the wire is in the here, pterygopalatine fossa. The maxillary nerve should supply this area. Yeah, I will demonstrate it to you. Just hang a minute. The infraorbital, the maxillary becoming infraorbital nerve, supplying the lower eyelid, part of the nose, and the upper lip. Okay? For this nerve to reach this area, it has to pass through the floor of the orbit. And the floor of the orbit, look, here we have either groove, as it is here. Please have a look. Here. Groove or canal. Infraorbital groove or canal. Now, if you put the wire here, and let me, before I demonstrate this to you, let me summarize the maxillary nerve. The maxillary nerve coming from the middle cranial fossa leaves the middle cranial fossa through foramen rotundum. It finds itself where? In the pterygopalatine fossa. It has a very important function there. In fact, the pterygopalatine ganglion which is a parasympathetic ganglion, is attached to the maxillary nerve. So as the maxillary nerve passes there, this important ganglion is attached to it. And it gives, it passes through it, and we may talk about it later on. In fact, I will, but not now, later on. Now, the maxillary nerve has major function to supply the face, but before it does so, it has to supply the teeth, the upper jaw, اللي هم الgum with teeth, sensory, okay? The only way to reach the upper teeth is to pass through the roof of the maxilla. The roof of the maxilla is nothing but the floor of the orbit, and that's why it's very thin. It goes as and becoming after pterygopalatine fossa. It needs to communicate with the orbit. How you gonna communicate between the orbit and the sphenopalatine or pterygopalatine fossa? Inferior orbital fissure. So as the maxillary nerve coming from the middle cranial fossa through foramen rotundum, it finds itself where? In the pterygopalatine or sphenopalatine fossa. Right in front of it is nothing but its gate towards mean the orbit. This is nothing but the inferior orbital fissure. And that's why it would carry and it finds itself where? In the orbit. Now it has nothing to do with the orbit. It needs to go where? To the face. But before it does so, it has to supply structures in the upper jaw. That's why, let me now demonstrate how the maxillary nerve reaches its target. From middle cranial fossa, foramen rotundum. Did you catch this? Now it finds itself where? Look, this area. Here. What's this? I will demonstrate this to you. Pterygopalatine. Now I need to manipulate here. It's going to be a bit hard for me to do so, maybe on the other side. I need to pass the wire. How complex this is. From the middle cranial fossa.
You want me to catch it for you?
Right. I need a forceps, in fact. معك forceps. لا بدي تجيب لي فرصة والله عشان I need to catch it from the other side. Look. حتى إذا ما دام أنت قاعد زي شوي البصل قوم شو اللي سجلتيها؟ عملية إديتنج عملية تشتبيك حرام خلص إذا أنت خلص الدرس وأنت نايم اصحى. نايم بالليل. مش نايم بالليل جاي تنام هون؟ خلص هي زبطت هيك. ثانك يو. طبعا هذول اوسخ شيء في الدنيا تقريبا صح؟ طلع عليهم زي السمنه. هنا ارسم لك اياه رسم. هلا بحكي لك سحر. This is the maxillary nerve. Let's summarize it. The maxillary nerve, it exits, leaves the skull through the foramen rotundum. It finds itself here in the sphenopalatine fossa, here. Sphenopalatine fossa. Then it goes to the orbit through
inferior
orbital fissure, sometimes through the canal, infraorbital groove or canal, okay, here, which is, you can see it here, it's clear, isn't it? It should be. The inferior orbital fissure find itself where? In the floor of the orbit. Then it goes through the canal, infraorbital canal, and it finds itself as infraorbital nerve, supplying the nose, upper lip, lower eyelid. Okay?